Hello, I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to our first streaming-only History is Lunch program. We're working with a skeleton crew from our home in the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. I hope that you'll join us next Wednesday when we'll live stream Jeff Gambrone presenting Pledged to One Country and One Flag, the Grand Army of the Republic in Mississippi. Today, we're delighted to have Jim Woodrick, author of the book The Civil War Siege of Jackson, Mississippi. A native of Meridian, Woodrick is the former director of the Historic Preservation Division of the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. He retired in the spring of this year as Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer. In earlier years, Woodrick managed the department's Mississippi Civil War Trails program, participated in a number of battlefield and campaign studies with the National Park Service, and worked closely with the Civil War Trust and the American Battlefield Protection Program to identify Civil War battlefield properties in Mississippi for acquisition and preservation. He is a graduate of Millsaps College, a licensed battlefield guide at Vicksburg National Military Park, and a member of the Historians of the Western Theater. If you have questions for Jim, you can ask them in the comments of this live stream, and we'll put those to him at the end of his talk. Now, here's Jim Woodrick.
Good afternoon. Before I begin, I want to say thank you to Chris Goodwin for inviting me to make this presentation today. I think it goes without saying that we are all involved in something that is an entirely new experience, and doing a program without a room full of people is certainly a new experience for me. So all I can ask is to wish me luck. On the morning of July 3rd, 1863, Union soldiers along the siege lines at Vicksburg began noticing white flags popping up along the Confederate works. As more and more flags appeared, the firing ceased. For the first time since May 18, there was silence, and men in blue and gray took advantage of the stillness to emerge from the trenches. The cause of the sudden respite from shot and shell was a truce to consider the terms of surrender for Fortress Vicksburg, and Major General Ulysses S. Grant, commander of the besieging Union Army of the Tennessee, and Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton, the beleaguered Confederate general who was the defender of Vicksburg, met underneath an oak tree between the lines to discuss surrender. Although no agreement was reached until the next morning, the 4th of July, the end was no longer in doubt. After 47 days of siege and more than a year of federal efforts to capture the city, Vicksburg was finally in Grant's pocket. Pemberton's troops, threadbare and near starvation, marched out of their trenches and stacked arms. Men in both armies, and certainly Grant, understood the significance of what had just transpired. As federal troops marched into Vicksburg to raise the U.S. flag over the courthouse, Grant could be satisfied that the surrender of Vicksburg, coupled in a few days with the fall of Port Hudson, Louisiana, resulted in the opening of the Mississippi River and had effectively split the Confederacy in two. For the South, the loss of Vicksburg, combined with the defeat of Robert E. Lee's army at Gettysburg, was a devastating defeat from which there was little hope of recovery. But the surrender of Vicksburg, as significant as it was not the end of the fighting in Mississippi in the summer of 1863. To complete the task at hand, Grant still had to face another Confederate army known as the Army of Relief, commanded by a respected adversary, Joseph E. Johnston. Joseph Eggleston Johnston was a native of Virginia and a West Point graduate. A Mexican War veteran, Johnston earned the respect of fellow officers, and at the beginning of the Civil War was the Quartermaster General of the United States Army. When Virginia seceded in 1861, Johnston resigned his post and expected, because of his high rank in the U.S. Army, to be recognized as the highest-ranking general in the newly formed Confederate States Army. But it was not to be. Instead, President Jefferson Davis elevated 3 other men to higher seniority than Johnston, and the perceived personal and professional slight created long-lasting animosity between the two men. Despite the ongoing feud between Johnston and Davis, Johnston was placed in command of the Confederate Army of Virginia in the early months of the war and led that army during the Peninsula Campaign until he was seriously wounded at the Battle of Seven Pines on May 31, 1862. His replacement would assume command of what would become the Army of Northern Virginia for the remainder of the war, and his name, of course, was Robert E. Lee. Although Johnston would take many months to recover from his wounds, Davis sent him west in November 1862 and assigned him to command a vast department which included both Pemberton's army in Mississippi and Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee. In December 1862, Johnston accompanied Davis to Jackson and then to Grenada to review the troops and give Mississippians the assurance that the government in Richmond would do everything in its power to protect the state from the growing threat of federal troops. Mississippians weren't comforted by Davis's assurances necessarily, nor was Johnston impressed with what he saw in Jackson or even of Vicksburg's defenses. Nevertheless, it was Johnston who would return to Mississippi in the spring of 1863 to rescue Pemberton and the state of Mississippi from U.S. Grant. As spring arrived in all its glory, Grant's Army of the Tennessee was engaged in a combined operation to capture Vicksburg. Marching his troops down the west side of the Mississippi River, the Union Navy, after bravely running the batteries at Vicksburg, ferried Grant's army to the Mississippi shore on April 30, May 1. At Port Gibson, outnumbered Confederate troops fought with fury for a day but could not stop Grant and the victorious Union Army, now firmly ensconced on the Mississippi side of the great river, and the Army moved into the interior of the state on the east side of the Big Black River. The news alarmed not only John C. Pemberton, but the authorities in Richmond as well, and in response they began shuttling troops from as far away as the Carolinas to Jackson. Johnston himself arrived on May 13, just a day after another Confederate force at the village of Raymond was pushed back by superior Union numbers. Johnston perhaps symbolically arrived in a pouring rain, and after briefly conferring with Brigadier General John Gregg, Johnston just as quickly determined that he could not hold Jackson and wired Richmond that he was too late. The next day, after holding action in the rain by Gregg's troops, Johnston abandoned the capital city and moved north into Madison County. Despite repeated and urgent pleas from both Davis and Confederate Secretary of War James Seddon, and despite reinforcements which eventually totaled approximately 30,000 men, Johnston would remain out of action throughout May and June. On May 14, the day after Johnston evacuated Jackson with approximately 6,000 men under his immediate command, two Union corps under the command of James Birdsey McPherson and William Tecumseh Sherman entered Jackson. Established in 1821 as the Mississippi state capital, Jackson was in essence carved out of the wilderness. The town's primary significance was its geographical location, which was roughly in the center of the new state. Although designated as the capital city, Jackson for many years had the look and feel of a rough frontier town, known perhaps more for its saloons than the center of state government. As a result, often more populous and prosperous towns lobbied the legislature to relocate the capital again, but Jackson's claim as the capital city was solidified with the construction of a new state house designed by architect William Nichols. Nichols also designed the stately governor's mansion a few blocks west of the state capitol. Both buildings are today considered among the state's greatest architectural treasures. Other prominent antebellum public buildings constructed helped transform Jackson from a frontier town into a real city. By 1860, Jackson had a full complement of retail, commercial, and industrial establishments, including drugstores, ready-made clothes, jewelry, and musical instruments, and boasted an impressive number of churches, restaurants, saloons, and hotels, the most prominent of which was the Bowman House, a 4-story brick structure on the corner of Emmett and State Streets. By far the most numerous type of establishment, however, were law offices. In 1860, more than 30 lawyers had offices in Jackson, and most located in close proximity to the Capitol building. By all accounts, Jackson was a booming place just prior to the Civil War, although the population did not exceed 3,500, slave and free. While Jackson's citizens had worked hard to create a prosperous business environment, it was the arrival of the railroads which really put the city on the map. As early as 1840, a rail line was established from Jackson to Vicksburg, connecting the capital city with the Mississippi River. In 1858, the New Orleans, Jackson, and Great Northern Railroad completed the link between Jackson and the Crescent City and continued north to Canton. The final link occurred in 1861 when the Southern Railroad of Mississippi completed construction of its line to Meridian. With railroads radiating in all directions, Jackson became an important crossroads town. This, of course, would make Jackson a tempting military target. It was also a political target as well, as it was the site of Mississippi's secession convention in 1861 and the seat of Mississippi's Confederate government. On January 7, 1861, 100 delegates convened at the state capitol to consider whether to leave the Union, and 2 days later did just that. This was a move strongly favored by Governor John Jones Pettus, although Governor Pettus was a fire-eating secessionist and delivered stirring proclamations about protecting Mississippians and Jackson in particular from the dreaded Yankees. The governor hastily abandoned the city with the approach of federal troops. And I should point out that he ordered both the treasury and the archives to be saved. After leaving Jackson as Grant's troops marched ever closer, the legislature would not return to the capital until after the war. On May 14, 2 Union corps converged on Jackson and occupied the city, leaving behind a wrecking force under the command of Brigadier General Joseph Mower. Sherman and McPherson's men marched west the next day, and Grant fought the pivotal Battle of Champion Hill on the 16th, driving Pemberton back to the Big Black River and thence into Vicksburg. After launching 2 unsuccessful assaults on May 19 and May 22nd, Grant settled down for a siege at Vicksburg. Back in Jackson, Mower's men burned a number of businesses which had been converted to manufacturing military supplies, ripped up rail lines around Jackson, and burned several other non-military establishments, including the Catholic Church and a hotel. Their work of destruction completed, Mower marched west in a couple of days to join the rest of the army. In short order, Confederate troops reoccupied Jackson. Johnston, however, remained in Madison County, constantly urging Pemberton to unite with his army and calling for reinforcements. As Grant's besieging lines drew tighter at Vicksburg, Johnston continued to gather reinforcements throughout May and into June, eventually collecting more than 30,000 men. Although his soldiers could easily hear the constant booming of Union cannon at Vicksburg, and despite Richmond's urgent appeals to Johnston to move his force to Pemberton's relief, Johnston still would not budge. Unlike Pemberton's beleaguered defenders at Vicksburg, who suffered from the heat and hunger in the trenches, many of Johnston's men enjoyed themselves in spite of the situation. "We had a splendid camping ground," wrote Robert Patrick of the 4th Louisiana Infantry, "being a lovely and retired grassy plot covered with luxuriant grass. Others, like James Bates, a soldier in the 9th Texas, enjoyed the ladies as much as their surroundings." None of this, however, did anything to relieve Pemberton. Finally, on July 1, Johnston began moving his army toward the Big Black River. By this time, however, Grant had received a large number of reinforcements and had established a formidable line to protect his army against any threat which Johnston might pose. It was too little, too late, and when the guns fell silent on July 3rd, Johnston immediately understood that Vicksburg was lost and just as quickly turned his army of relief around and headed back to Jackson. Even before Grant's troops entered Vicksburg, he had determined that Johnston had to be dispatched, and he ordered William T. Sherman to prepare to march east and defeat Johnston's army. "I want Johnston broken up as effectually as possible, and roads," meaning railroads, "destroyed," Grant wrote Sherman. And Sherman, as directed, began assembling an expeditionary force to march on Jackson. Born in 1820 in Lancaster, Ohio, Sherman graduated from West Point in 1840 and spent several years in the Army out west, including service in the Mexican War, although he saw no action. In 1853, he resigned his commission and entered a variety of businesses, all of which failed. In 1859, he became superintendent of the Louisiana State Seminary, the predecessor to Louisiana State University, where he remained until 1861. At that point, he returned north and secured an appointment as the colonel of the 13th U.S. Infantry. Sherman rose quickly in rank and was promoted to major general in May 1862. Throughout the Vicksburg campaign, he successfully led the 15th Corps and was among Grant's most trusted lieutenants. Despite turning in a terrible performance in his first independent operation at Chickasaw Bayou in December 1862, Grant and Sherman had clearly learned to trust each other. As such, it was Sherman who would be given the task of defeating the much more experienced Joe Johnston. For the expedition, Sherman would have at his disposal 13 divisions, consisting of all the troops he had commanded on the exterior line, reinforced by 6 more divisions from the 13th and 15th Corps, which had been engaged in siege operations. In all, he would command more than 45,000 men. Beginning July 6, Sherman began crossing the Big Black at 3 different locations, including the Big Black River Bridge, which had been burned on May 17, plus Messengers and Birdsong's ferries. Contesting the crossings were several units of Confederate cavalry under the command of William Wirt Adams and John Whitfield, a rather dour-looking native of Franklin, Tennessee, and a Mexican War veteran. Adams operated along the main road to Jackson and constantly skirmished with the advancing Union column. Despite the presence of Confederate cavalry, the crossing went rather smoothly for Sherman, with one exception. At Birdsong's Ferry, Whitfield's Texans peppered the men of the Union 9th Corps as they tried to cross. To further complicate matters, the water level rose and the swift current caused a makeshift bridge to collapse, taking with it part of an artillery battery. The delayed crossing upset Sherman's aggressive timetable. All the while, Johnston's Army of Relief marched east toward Jackson, a movement described in the 16th Louisiana Infantry, a soldier in the 16th Louisiana, as a hard and very hot march. Though difficult on the men, the delay afforded by Whitfield's defense of the river crossing allowed Johnston some much-needed breathing room ahead of Sherman's juggernaut. For all the soldiers involved in the Jackson expedition, whether blue or gray, the weather was a deadly and complicating factor. The heat and dust was overwhelming, and both sides suffered terribly from the blistering heat and lack of fresh water. The drought which had descended on the area was made worse by the retreating Confederates, who threw dead animal carcasses into the ponds and cisterns to do, as they say, poison the well. Desperate for water, many Union soldiers were forced to drink the polluted water anyway. For their part, and perhaps in retribution, Union soldiers burned and looted houses along the way, including that of the home of Jefferson Davis's brother, Joe Davis. As Sherman's columns marched toward Jackson, Johnston's men filed into the city on July 7. His exhausted troops found that the fortifications surrounding Jackson were poorly constructed and ill-conceived for the defense of the city. As a result, parties of soldiers, impressed slaves, and even some civilians worked vigorously in the broiling sun to strengthen the fortifications on the morning of July 8. Once completed, the earthworks, reinforced by cotton bales and featuring several salient battery positions, encircled Jackson and were anchored above and below on the Pearl River. The next day, as Union forces continued their advance, Johnston issued an address to his troops. In uncharacteristically stirring prose, Johnston urged the Army of Relief to stand firm. "Fellow soldiers," he said, "an insolent foe, flushed with hope by his recent success at Vicksburg, confronts you, threatening the people whose homes and liberties you are here to protect with plunder and conquest. Their guns may now even be heard at intervals as they advance. This enemy is at once the mission and duty of you brave men to chastise and expel from the soil of Mississippi. The commanding general confidently relies on you to sustain this pledge he makes in advance, and will be with you in your good work until the end." After announcing a great victory by Lee's army in Pennsylvania, which of course wasn't true, Johnston concluded his address by saying, "The country expects in this, the great crisis of its destiny, that every man will do his duty." The army that Johnston had assembled at Jackson was an impressive force. Beginning on the northern end of the line, Johnston's divisions were commanded by William Wing Loring, William Henry Talbot Walker, Samuel French, and John Cable Breckenridge, plus a cavalry division commanded by William H. Red Jackson, whose troops would operate on the east side of the Pearl River and be used as a mobile strike force. Of the 5 division commanders, the best was perhaps Breckenridge, a former United States vice president under President Buchanan and a fine combat officer. His division, located on the south end of the city, was the largest in Johnston's army and the most experienced, and included both the famed Orphan Brigade from Kentucky and a company of the equally famous Washington Artillery from New Orleans. It would be Breckenridge's force that would be engaged in the most severe fighting during the siege of Jackson. After dealing with the ever-present Confederate cavalry and the excessive heat, Sherman's force finally arrived on the outskirts of Jackson on July 9 and began marching into the city on the morning of the 10th. Given Johnston's previous evacuation of the city on May 14, Sherman hoped that he would again withdraw. Such was not the case, however, as the head of his advancing column suddenly came under artillery fire on the Clinton Road, which is now West Capitol Street. Convinced that Johnston intended to make a stand, Sherman issued orders for his troops to begin encircling the city and began constructing battery positions. By July 11, most of his army had completed their movements, all the while engaged in combat with frequent Confederate attacks. On the right end of Sherman's line was the 13th Corps, the Army's largest, commanded by Major General Edward Otho Cresap Ord, who replaced John McClernand as Corps commander during the siege of Vicksburg after McClernand was sacked by Grant. Ord's troops, once in position, would face elements of French's and Breckenridge's division. In the center was Sherman's own corps, the 15th, temporarily commanded by Frederick Steele. On the left, and covering the northern section of Jackson, was John G. Parke's 9th Corps. Unlike most of Sherman's troops, the 9th Corps largely hailed from the eastern seaboard states and had only arrived in Mississippi in June. The Easterners were looked on with a mixture of bemusement and disdain by Union soldiers from the Midwest. Parke's men had never been farther south than Kentucky at this point in the war, so they must have suffered terribly in the Mississippi sun. However, they marched just as hard as Sherman's Westerners and had marched cross-country to arrive on the northern outskirts of Jackson. Here they found the state's insane asylum located where the present-day University Hospital is located, and the patients were still there when the Federals arrived, no doubt making for a few interesting exchanges. After securing the insane asylum ridge, Park's men advanced into the area that is present-day Belhaven and established siege lines west to extend across what is now the Millsaps College campus. Park and the other corps commanders, by Sherman's order, began a bombardment of the city. However, Sherman had a limited supply of ammunition and requested additional ammunition from a supply depot on the Big Black River. It would take several days for the supply train to reach Jackson. As such, the Union bombardment would be limited in scale. In addition to an artillery barrage, Sherman ordered his troops to begin testing the Confederate defenses by launching attacks with what is termed a reconnaissance in force. One such assault took place on the northern end of the line. As the sun rose on the morning of July 11, Park's men moved south toward the Confederate lines. One regiment, however, the 2nd Michigan Infantry, pushed too far and got too close. Part of Colonel Daniel Leisure's brigade, the Michiganders were acting as skirmishers for the brigade. Thinking they had been ordered to advance, the Wolverines darted toward the works held by Loring's veteran troops, who were posted on the high ground just south of present-day Fortification Street. After scattering a Confederate camp at the base of the main defensive line, the 2nd Michigan almost reached the Confederate works before realizing that the rest of the brigade had not followed. By that time, it was too late for the regiment to stop. Continuing the advance unsupported, they fell back only when it was evident that reinforcements were hurrying to Loring's assistance. Although they failed to reach the Confederate works, the 2nd Michigan had done well enough to elicit praise from their brigade commander, and it convinced Sherman that the Confederate line was in fact heavily defended. By sundown, he was also well satisfied that all 3 of his corps were in position in front of the Confederate works, with the exception of the far right flank. There, Jacob Lauman's division of the 13th Corps had not yet been able to deploy. Thus far, Sherman's men had escaped any serious bloodshed at the hands of Johnston's veterans, but that would change the next day. On the morning of July 12, Union guns again opened fire on Johnston's line inside the city, many of the gunners aiming at the cupola of the state capitol. For the next hour, Union artillery crews fired 3,000 rounds of shot and shell into the city of Jackson. The bombardment did little impact on Johnston's army, but resulted in setting several buildings ablaze. After the bombardment ended, troops in Brigadier General Alvin Hovey's division of the 13th Corps moved forward and established a line of earthworks in what was then known as Winter's Woods, but today is known as Battlefield Park. Hovey's advance soon encountered Confederates from Evander McNair's Arkansas Brigade in his front, and heavy skirmishing ensued. The skirmishing soon became very sharp, he reported, and for an hour the conflict was entitled to the name of battle. The enemy burned several houses in our front and opened upon us with canister, grape, shell, and musketry. Advancing on a 2-brigade front, Hovey's men slowly drove the Confederates back. The fighting continued for an hour and a half until Federal batteries were in position to rake the Confederates in their front, and Hovey's troops dug in. To his right, and on the far right end of Sherman's line, was a division commanded by Brigadier General Jacob Lauman. Lauman's division had yet to move into position astride Hovey's to complete the encirclement of Jackson. To correct that, he formed his troops on the slopes of Bailey's Hill and moved forward with his left anchored on the railroad. Crossing Lynch Creek, his lead brigade under Isaac Pugh, who you see in the image there, pulled astride Hovey's division, and then advanced a bit further to the edge of a cornfield. Across the way, Pugh could see the heavily defended earthworks held by John C. Breckenridge's veteran troops bristling with infantry and artillery. Reluctant to move forward, Pugh asked that Lauman come to the front and assess the situation. After looking at the field, Lauman ordered Pugh's 4-regiment brigade forward, despite the misgivings of its commander. Ordered to advance, the blue line rushed forward into the maelstrom, and Breckenridge's men opened up. Pugh reported it as a murderous fire on my whole line. Major George W. Crosley, who commanded the 3rd Iowa Infantry during the attack, wrote that his men answered the greeting with a shout and rushed forward to the assault. We were met by a perfect storm of grape, canister, and musketry. They were an easy target, and within minutes, Pugh's brigade was completely shattered, many of his men waving handkerchiefs in an attempt to end the terrible slaughter. In the ill-advised attack, Pugh lost more than 50% of his brigade. Among the dead was the colonel of the 53rd Illinois Infantry, Seth C. Earle, who was pierced by 4 pieces of canister and fell near the Confederate works. His body, along with many others, was buried where he fell. He was later reinterred to the Vicksburg National Cemetery. In addition to inflicting hundreds of casualties, the Confederates captured 3 regimental flags, an exceptionally large number of battle trophies for a relatively small engagement. One of the Union soldiers assigned to protect the regimental colors of the 53rd Illinois was a sergeant named George Poundstone. The 34-year-old was shot in the thigh by a piece of canister during the assault. Despite this wound, Sergeant Poundstone managed to tear the flag from its staff and stuff the banner in his coat to try to save it from being captured. Also shot in the left eye and the heart, Poundstone lay on the battlefield with the flag drenched in his blood until he was captured by the Confederates after the battle and taken behind the lines. Though grievously wounded in the assault, Poundstone somehow managed to survive another 11 days before dying in Vicksburg on July 23rd. His body was later taken home by his father and brother and laid to rest. The banner he so desperately tried to protect is also back home. In 1885, the flag was located at the War Department in Washington and returned to Illinois. Today, the 53rd Illinois flag, still bearing Sergeant Poundstone's bloodstains, which you can see in the lower right-hand corner of the flag, has been restored and is on display in Streator, Illinois. It was along this section of the Confederate line that an unusual incident occurred involving, of all things, a piano. Near the trenches occupied by the Washington artillery was a mansion known as the Cooper House. Burned by the Confederates in order to provide a field of fire, men from the battery, at the family's request, went into the house and rescued whatever items they could, including a piano, which was hoisted over the parapet and into the earthworks of the Washington artillery. Before and after the attack by Pugh's brigade, some of the more musically inclined members of the battery played and sang around the piano. After the siege, the piano was left behind and captured by Sherman's men, but incredibly, the instrument survived the war. Today, the piano resides in the Confederate Memorial Hall Museum in New Orleans, and I'd just like to put out there that it deserves to be in the museum in Mississippi. After the disastrous attack by Pugh's brigade, Jacob Lauman was immediately relieved from duty and returned to Vicksburg. He would never again command troops in the field. Meanwhile, the dead and wounded lay in the hot Mississippi sun for 2 days without any attempt by Sherman to retrieve them. Finally, with the smell of the quickly decomposing bodies unbearable for either army, a truce was observed for a time to bury the dead. Their remains were so decomposed by this time that the Confederates used converted cotton bale hooks on long poles to roll the bodies into ditches. And I hope no one's trying to eat lunch at this point. Along the rest of the line, soldiers from both sides took the opportunity to visit the lines, between the lines, rather. J.P. Cannon, a soldier in the 27th Alabama and Loring's Division, remembered that the halt in the fighting was a pleasant respite from the exciting times of the 5 days preceding. Many of us met the boys in blue on halfway ground and held friendly conversation with them while the gruesome work was carried on. At 4:00 p.m., the tap of the drum warned us that recess was over, and we hastened back to the cover of our ditches. Although he did not order the attack, Sherman had learned his lesson. There would be no more assaults, although there would be several probes along the lines to determine Confederate strength. Based on the response from Confederate batteries, particularly the salient battery called the Cotton Bell Battery, which is located near present-day Baptist Hospital here in Jackson, Johnston's men were still full of fight. There was also other work to do. When Grant ordered Sherman to Jackson, he instructed him to break up as many railroads as possible. To that end, Sherman sent raiding parties both north and south of Jackson during the siege. To the south, a small Union cavalry force made it as far as Brookhaven, wrecking trestles and burning depots along the way. North of Jackson, a larger force of cavalry and infantry moved toward Canton, where there were several railroad buildings and large warehouses. To assist the cavalry, Sherman sent a brigade of infantry under Colonel Charles R. Woods. Moving up the railroad, Woods' brigade, which was composed largely of German immigrants from Missouri and was known as the German Light Brigade, burned the depot and other buildings at Calhoun Station. Ironically, other German immigrants from Indiana would move south in the early 20th century and purchase the farmland that was once Calhoun Station, and they renamed it Gluckstadt. Wood's brigade, supported by the cavalry, continued north and after several sharp skirmishes entered Canton. Unlike Jackson's fate, Canton was spared the torch. Many of the soldiers, in fact, remarking on the beauty of the town. However, the machine shops and other manufacturing facilities went up in flames. While all this was going on, Sherman was still waiting on the supply train to arrive with heavy artillery ammunition. When Johnston was apprised of the situation, he attempted to intercept the supply wagons by sending William H. Jackson's cavalry to Clinton. Sherman's men, however, were tipped off and waiting on Jackson's cavalry, and you'll have to read my book to find out how that happened, hint, hint. And the Confederates failed to halt the arrival of the ammunition. Accordingly, Joseph E. Johnston began making preparations to once again abandon the capital city of Mississippi. When the sun rose on July 17, all was still. Union soldiers cautiously approached the Confederate lines and found that Johnston and his army had slipped out of their trenches and retreated across the Pearl River during the night. The first troops to enter Jackson, ironically, were men of Parke's Ninth Corps. The fact that these eastern seaboard troops were the first on the scene rankled Sherman's Westerners to no end. Securing the state capitol and the governor's mansion where Sherman established his headquarters, the victorious general hosted a dinner for his generals on the night of July 18. Elsewhere in Jackson, Sherman's men celebrated their victory in a different way. Numerous private dwellings and businesses were looted, soldiers with their prized possessions parading in the streets, and fires broke out. Some were intentionally set to destroy machine shops and factories. Others simply got out of hand or were set with the intent of punishing the citizens of Jackson. Either way, Jackson was heavily damaged in the aftermath of the siege and earned the nickname Chimneyville. According to a newspaper correspondent who visited the city soon after Johnston departed, he reported that there were not 10 buildings left standing upon both sides of State Street. The same is the case upon the streets leading from State Street to the New Orleans Railroad. And look in whichever direction you may from the front of the Capitol, ruin meets the eye. The work of destruction proceeded until July 23rd, with miles of track upended, heated, and twisted. These became known as Sherman's neckties. With the destruction complete, including Brandon, which was burned soon after Jackson by a force commanded by Frederick Steele, Sherman's expeditionary force began the long, hot march back to Vicksburg. At last, the Vicksburg campaign was over, as Johnston had retreated to the eastern edges of the state. Vicksburg would continue to be occupied by Union troops throughout the remainder of the war, and many of the occupation forces were newly minted African American soldiers serving in the United States colored troop regiments. Grant, Sherman, and the other commanders who won the Vicksburg campaign went on to other theaters of operation. Sherman and Johnston would meet again the next time in the Atlanta campaign. And of course, they would meet for a final time at Bennett Place when Johnston would surrender the Army of Tennessee to Sherman in North Carolina. Let me go back to that slide and just mention that the casualties, you note that the Union killed were 129. Almost all of those were a result of Pugh's disastrous attack on July 12. Now, if confession is good for the soul, I will go ahead and confess that when I began work on this book, it was my intent to prove that while Jackson was certainly damaged during the war, it was not completely wrecked and did not necessarily deserve the nickname Chimneyville. Now, I was not alone in my skepticism. Over the years, a number of scholars have cast doubt on the extent of the damage that Jackson suffered during the war. And this is based largely on a panoramic photograph taken in 1869 by a local photographer. And this is just one of the parts of that panoramic photograph. Taken from the cupola of the state capitol, now the old Capitol Museum, the photograph shows an expanding but still somewhat rural city with a substantial number of structures clearly fronting State Street opposite the Capitol, including a 2-story Spengler's Corner building, among other identifiable structures. Because of the presence of so many intact buildings, the image seems to indicate that the city was not damaged as much as previously thought. So I was determined to prove once and for all that Chimneyville was largely a myth. What I found, however, based on an overwhelming number of primary accounts from both citizens and soldiers and from newspaper accounts in the post-war period, is that Jackson, in fact, was heavily damaged and rightly earned the nickname Chimneyville, and that the panoramic photograph, in fact, shows a city being reborn. Over the years, the siege of Jackson has received little attention from historians. Unlike the Vicksburg National Military Park, where hundreds of monuments, markers, and tablets dot the rolling landscape to mark the siege and defense lines, the battlefield at Jackson has disappeared over time. Like other urban battlefields, many of the sites associated with the siege have long since been paved over, and there are a few physical reminders of the events which occurred in the summer of 1863. And unlike the siege of Vicksburg or the Battle of Gettysburg, the conflict in Jackson ended without a dramatic surrender or a final charge. For these reasons and many others, the story of Jackson's Civil War siege has been largely forgotten. For a week, however, more than 70,000 men, blue and gray, fought under a hot Mississippi sun for the control of Mississippi's capital city. Many were wounded and scarred for life. Others, like Sergeant Poundstone, gave his life for his country. I think they need to be remembered. Thank you very much.
Jim, we have a couple of questions from the live feed. Cheyenne Brenner asks, why didn't the South surrender after the loss of Vicksburg? Was it at least a recommendation by a Southern Army commander?
I don't think there was any recommendation at that point by any Confederate commanders to surrender. There were still large parts of the Confederacy that were controlled by Confederate armies. Middle Tennessee was still somewhat in control. All of Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina. And you have to recall that many parts of even Mississippi were soon reoccupied by Confederate forces when the larger part of the Union Army left the scene. But I think the answer is probably mostly a political question. The impetus to surrender was just not there yet, and it probably really took hold after Atlanta fell. That was the big nut to crack, at least in the Western theater. That's a good question.
And then sort of piggybacking on that, Diane Williams asks what was going on in other parts of the state, such as Corinth, around the time of the fall of Vicksburg.
Well, the action in Corinth actually took place in 1862. Following the Battle of Shiloh on April 6 and 7, the very large Union Army that assembled there under the direction of Henry W. Halleck moved south to Corinth and laid what is known as a siege to Corinth. But like Jackson, there was a backdoor escape for the Confederate Army, and so it never actually ended in the capitulation of a Confederate Army there. But by May 1862, the Federals had Corinth in their possession. That fall, in October 1862, a Confederate Army under Earl Van Dorn attempted to retake Corinth in a surprise attack emanating from the northwest portion of the city. But Corinth by that time was well defended, and the two-day battle turned out to be a disastrous attack by Van Dorn's army. After that, Grant, who now took command of the troops in what we call the North Mississippi area, began a very slow march down the Mississippi Central Railroad in northeast Mississippi toward Pemberton's army, which at that time was at Grenada. For various reasons, including Van Dorn's raid on Holly Springs in December of 1862, Grant pulled back from that and decided to move downriver, and that's where we get into what we know as the Vicksburg campaign, the classic portion of the campaign, what I call the final phase. So Corinth by that time was out of the scene, and it would be, for the most part, occupied by federal forces for the rest of the war, except very late in the war.
And one other, could you say a few more words about how you came to write the book?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. As I indicated, there has not been much written on the siege of Jackson, and I think there are a lot of reasons for that. Again, I think it's because there's not much to see here, with the exception of Battlefield Park. And if I may, since I've got a few minutes, let me talk about Battlefield Park, which you see on the left here. If you go there during the day, you'll see this identified as a Confederate park, and that these are Confederate trenches. And you'll see some cannon out there, if they're still there. The cannon are pointing the wrong direction, and they're from the Spanish-American War. And as I told many people, other than that, everything's correct. They were actually the trenches dug by Alvin Hovey's division of the 13th Corps during the siege of Jackson. And the cannon, as I said, were American guns from the Spanish-American War. Now, how did I come about writing the book? There had been a previous book that encompassed both the Battle of Jackson, which I described, that's the one that took place on May 14, and the Siege of Jackson, which was co-written by Warren Grayboe, who was a dear friend, and the amazing Edwin C. Bars, former chief historian at Vicksburg National Military Park and chief historian for the National Park Service. That book was published by the Jackson Civil War Roundtable. It's been out of print for many years. And I started talking to Warren Grayboe years ago about redoing that book, both on the battle and the siege of Jackson. And we did a little bit of talking. Warren was good at talking, just as I like to talk, and sent me some materials, but Warren had the audacity to do something that upended the project. He went and died on me. And so I had to put off for a while. I sort of dismissed it from my mind, but something kept nagging at me that told me I needed to take this project on. And one day, I was in the Capers building here on the Archives and History campus, and I had been reading a letter from a Union soldier, and I realized that the Union soldier had written that letter from the door stoop of the old Capitol Museum right outside my window. And I decided then and there I had to do it. And so I wrote up a proposal to the History Press, and they were great to work with, and sent it in, and they said, "It sounds great, let's do it." And that's when I said, "Oh, my goodness, now what?" I'd never written a book. So I quickly found out that the deadlines are usually pretty freely expanded for authors, but I was glad to finally get it done. And hopefully my goal of having these men remembered has been achieved.
We've had a couple more questions come through if you've got time to answer
Certainly.
them. Sarah Campbell asks, at what point did the colored troops who joined in after Vicksburg become involved in significant action? Where and in what ways were they used?
All right, good question. During the Vicksburg campaign, United States colored troops were first engaged at the Battle of Milliken's Bend, which was on the Louisiana side of the river. That would be in June 1863. Other than peripherally, they were not involved in the siege of Vicksburg itself. And their main contribution to the war effort would not come until the bulk of the white troops, if you will, moved on to other theaters of war. And as I indicated, large numbers of United States colored troops occupied Vicksburg and Greenville and Natchez and Memphis and other towns and cities along the river. And in 1864, these units developed into, some of them were rather good regiments. I'd specifically mention the 3rd United States Colored Cavalry. That was their designation, Colored Cavalry. They went on a number of raids into the interior of the state, often operating on their own, independently of any other troops. They were also involved in United States colored troops, that is, were involved in the Tupelo expedition. They were engaged at Price's Crossroads in June 1864, and really made a vital contribution to the war effort in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas especially.
Walter Neely asks, are the cannons at the Millsaps Library authentic?
Well, there is a cannon there, and I hate to admit it, but I'm sure it's authentic, but I don't know where it came from, and I'm embarrassed to say that as a graduate of Millsaps College. I guess this goes to show what it's like being a young skull full of mush, but I didn't even notice that hole in that cannon until I had graduated. and then I wondered what it was. I understand that hole in front of the academic complex is supposed to be a pit, if you will, for a Union sniper, but I don't know. I don't know where it came from. But somebody's going to find that out someday, but it won't be me.
Jim Rosenblatt asks, were any of the dead buried in Greenwood Cemetery here in Jackson?
Yes. In fact, some of the Confederate dead were buried in Greenwood Cemetery, certainly. And there was a civilian killed during the siege. I didn't mention him, but his name was Colonel Withers. We don't know where the colonel part came from, but he grabbed his rifle and started fighting with some of the orphan brigade in front of his house, who had been moving furniture in and out of his house during the siege to protect his possessions. Colonel Withers was rather elderly and was killed on, I believe, July 11, I believe. And he was initially buried in Greenwood Cemetery. But yes, I don't know exactly how many were buried as a result of the siege of Jackson in the Greenwood Cemetery. There are a number of unknowns out there, but certainly some. All of the Union dead, of course, would either be reinterred, as was Sergeant Poundstone in his home state, or moved to the Vicksburg National Cemetery.
One last question, apropos of your last remark there, from Deirdre Payne, who compliments your presentation and then says, Poundstone was a hero. What are the odds that flag will ever get back to Jackson?
Thank you, Deirdre. Slim to none. And yes, he was absolutely a hero. And about a year and a half ago, I had the distinct honor of touring the gentleman who has made the preservation of that flag a reality. I won't call his name, but he is from Streator, Illinois. He and his wife came down, and they're delightful people. And I don't think it will ever come back. And that's okay. It's in a great place. It's on display in the public library in Streator, and I've never been there. And on my bucket list is to return the favor and go see that flag. But I was able to show him approximately where Sergeant Poundstone was mortally wounded. Thank you for asking.
If you have not read Jim's fine book, you can find copies of it at bookstores around town, the state. You can order them directly from the museum store here, and we've put the email address of the store manager in the comments on the live feed to accomplish that. Thank you all for watching this today. Join us next week when Jeff Gambrone will be discussing another Civil War themed program on the Grand Army of the Republic, the largest fraternal organization for black and white Union soldiers after the Civil War. We're looking forward to that. Thank you again for being with us. Thank you, Jim Woodrick.
Thank you.